Okay, good day, people. So, greetings. Hope everyone is well. What I'm going to do today is something a little bit different. I'm going to present one of my most recent papers, which is called Comprehending Orders of Intentionality, an adaptation of Laing, Philipson, and Lee's interpersonal perception method. And what I'm going to try to do is give an overview of some of the key concepts that I've developed in here and some of the key terms for analysis, and then walk through a series of 5 different examples that illustrate the sources of interpersonal conflict and dispute, and try to tease out some of the reasons why sort of persistent patterns of conflict can occur. Now, one of the sort of introductory background thinkers that sort of precipitated this line of thought was Robin Dunbar in his Grooming Gossip and the Evolution of Language. This isn't really the central work, but this is sort of a launch pad into the ideas, partly because he lays out some concepts very clearly. He tries to describe what he's calling different orders of intentionality as they apply in evolutionary biology and developmental psychology. And he's talking basically about mental states and beliefs, and he offers this concept of intentionality, or even orders of intentionality, where he's suggesting that someone can have a mental state or a belief about something, and then someone else can have a mental state or a belief about that person's belief. And it sort of escalates into a belief about a belief about a belief, and then you have third order intentionality. And what he says is that in both evolutionary biology and in developmental psychology, this has come to be known as theory of mind. And the theory of mind is basically recognizing that other people have beliefs, and perhaps that those beliefs can be false, that people can be operating by a set of false beliefs. And so there are things like false belief tests that tell whether or not a person has a theory of mind. But it also is giving adequate subjective status to your own beliefs. It's realizing how your beliefs can look to another person. Now, the main source of inspiration for the work really came from Ronald David Laing. And, Laing, Philipson, and Lee, they had created what was called the IPM, or the interpersonal perception method. And this was a diagnostic tool. It's a sort of questionnaire interview technique where dysfunctional couples would come in, and these dysfunctional couples were really characterized by sick kinds of relationships, constant quarreling, disputes where they couldn't get settled who exactly was the source of the problem. And Laing, he wrote an interesting collection of poetry called Knots. I think there's even a second one, but it's where he documents what he calls the spiral of reciprocal perspectives. And it has to do with people second guessing and second judging what other people think. And it's sort of this, I think that you think that I think that you think, and it just sort of, wavers out of control. And part of the question became, why do such conflicts as this occur? But then how can we remediate these? What could be done to sort of alleviate the stress and the trauma that's associated? How could we disentangle these kinds of knots? How can we help people minimize their conflicts and maybe even grasp and comprehend the source of all of it? Now, okay, so we got to get at why do such conflicts occur? Exactly how are they occurring? There are a lot of different influences. One would be just simple deception. I don't think we want to deny that people aren't always honest with one another, right? Sometimes they're trying to hide their feelings, they're trying to manage their vulnerability, sometimes they're just out for personal gain. But the point of the fact is that people, given that they can be aware of others' mental states and they can engage in forms of deception, they routinely do. But it's also that people don't believe what other people say. Sometimes people don't trust what other people have said. They may change their mind. But even those, I think those are pretty clear, and those make it look as if interpersonal conflict always has some malicious intent behind it. But it doesn't really. Oftentimes, there's simple differences in interpretation, and they have to do with the way experience itself gets interpreted through the upbringing, the background, the kind of experiences a person has had maybe in their youth. For for someone like Ronald David Laing and his team, he saw so many couples where the experience and the interpretation were integrated. They're overlaid so that when a person has a certain experience, it's shot through with the interpretive framework, and it seems very natural to them what they're experiencing, but they don't realize the degree to which that experience is already overlaid with a sort of culturally valued interpretive framework. One way to illustrate this would be to say that the exact same act could be seen as generous or ostentatious. It could be seen as courageous or foolhardy, or it could be sensitive or weak, or reserved or aloof, or masculine or overbearing, or whatever. It could be friendly or seductive, depending upon how someone is interpreting that act. Now, maybe one more robust example, just to help illustrate it, and then we'll let this go, is take the act of a couple's been together for a while, maybe they're engaged or even married, and at a certain point, this may happen, doesn't always happen, but the male, and again, this is a heteronormative example, but if you have a male and female, sort of a married couple, and if the male cries in front of the female, it can be experienced in very different ways. That is, depending upon the woman's upbringing, upon her cultural values, upon the previous discussions they've had, the whole relationship trajectory, but also the way her parents acted in front of her, all of those, they could lead to seeing those exact same tears as either a sign of sensitivity or as a sign of weakness. But it's not simply given in the act, but it does seem like the act just naturally has a meaning because the interpretation so fuses it. Okay, that hopefully is enough of a backdrop on sort of R.D. Laing and this methodology that he created for dysfunctional couples. Now, what I've tried to do is to adapt this in a much more freewheeling way to just look at examples of conversational snippets, places where people are having disputes, and to try to see if their methodology could be brought to bear on it. And I think it can be quite robustly. So here's what I tried to develop. Now, the first thing we need to do is look at some of the basic concepts. And I've written out here direct perspectives, meta perspectives, and meta-meta perspectives, which correspond to first order, second order, and third order intentionality. Now, you can see I've also tried to aid in memory here by color coding these alphabetically. So it's blue, green, yellow, and the blue, green, yellow stands for, in that order, direct, meta, and meta-meta. And so hopefully that will help people keep that a little bit clearer. But what do we mean by a direct perspective? Well, a direct perspective is a person's view on an issue or relation. It's again, it's a first order intentionality, it's a direct belief. A meta perspective, it refers to a person's view of some other person's view of that same issue or relation. And it has to be the same issue or relation, or it gets all confused. We're not going to be able to track our analysis the way that we want to. Third order intentionality, what's called a meta-meta perspective. This refers to a person's view of another's view of that first person's view of that issue or relationship. Now, once we have these basic concepts down, we're ready to consider the terms that we need for analysis. Now, not to scare anyone off, this is easily the most complex slide that we're going to be looking at, most sort of detailed filled. This overviews the different kinds of conflicts and disputes that can happen when a couple is quarreling or when a couple is having a conflict. And we need to be very careful and very precise in explicitly tracking these differences in these terms. And part of it is, this precision is needed because what Laing and Philipson and Lee have discovered is that people can be in agreement or disagreement with one another with either one of them not understanding that. And that there's a difference between disagreement and misunderstanding. And so then they started to discover that there are also elements of people not realizing that they're in a misunderstanding, or that sometimes they feel as if they're being understood where in fact they're really not. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to try to track out all of these different terms and these relationships as they apply to particular couples having squabbles and we're going to first look for their basic perspectives, whether they're direct, meta, and meta-meta, and then we're going to try to track them through this. So first, let's look at the terms here again real quickly. You assess agreement or disagreement by looking for a conjunction or a disjunction between both persons' direct perspectives. Now, agreement or disagreement is the only form of analysis that you can perform simultaneously for both partners. You just look at both of their direct perspectives. If there's a conjunction, they're in agreement. If there's a disjunction, they're in disagreement. Understanding and misunderstanding, those are a little bit trickier. You're going to have to do it for each person, and the person, what you do there when you're looking for understanding or misunderstanding, you look for one person's meta perspective to the other person's direct. If there's a conjunction, the person whose meta perspective was under consideration, they understand. If there's a disjunction, they misunderstand. And notice here I have, A and D and U and M, and I'm going to use a small notation system to help people as we're tracking these cases sort of keep this all in view. So in addition to agreement, disagreement, understanding, and misunderstanding, we also have the feeling of being understood and the feeling of being misunderstood. Now here you're going to need at least a meta-meta perspective, right? You're going to have to go all the way down to that third order intentionality. So in order to assess whether someone has the feeling of being understood or the feeling of being misunderstood, what you do is you compare their own direct perspective to their own meta-meta perspective. If you find a conjunction, they'll have the feeling of being understood, and if you find a disjunction, they will have the feeling of being misunderstood. The last analysis that we'll perform, and you want to perform them in this order, is realization. And this refers to, does the person realize, and there it could be that they're being understood, that they're being misunderstood, or it could trace all the way down to whether or not they're understood in their agreement or not. But just for purposes of simplicity here, realization refers to a conjunction between one person's meta-meta perspective and the other person's meta, and a failure refers to a disjunction between one person's meta-meta perspective and the other person's meta perspective. Okay, so I realize that's probably all still very nebulous, not clear. It'll come very clear once we get to the analyses. So let's move on to the analysis. So first example here, this is example number 1, and it's going to begin just with first and second order intentionality. So what you want to do is you want to look at the case, and first we'll just read it out loud. So here's the case. Greta says, I don't really love him, but Henry thinks that I do. Now Henry says, even though Greta doesn't love me, she believes that she does. Okay, now we can just begin right here and say, how would a conflict like this happen? Was it deception? Is it differences of background? And we want to ask that for every one of these examples. You sort of want to begin with, what exactly led this couple into this particular situation? At any rate, we need to now look very carefully at this and see if we can identify the direct perspectives and meta perspectives. And so we try to locate those, and once we've looked, we see, and that pretty much looks like what the direct and meta perspectives are. Again, blue, green, yellow in that order. So once we've identified the perspectives, now we can start to analyze them by comparing. When we look to their direct perspectives, Greta says, I don't really love him. Henry says, Greta doesn't love me. Their direct perspectives are in conjunction. They're in agreement. And what are they in agreement about? The fact that Greta doesn't really love Henry. Now, when you ask the question of understanding or misunderstanding, here we're going to look at Greta's meta perspective and compare it to Henry's direct. Greta's meta perspective is in disjunction, so she misunderstands their agreement. And how does she do that? Look, she says, Henry thinks that I do, but Henry says, Greta doesn't love me. You go to the next one. Now we're going to look for Henry to see whether he understands, or whether he understands or misunderstands. And in this case, we look to his meta perspective, comparing it to Greta's direct. And Henry's meta perspective also is in disjunction with Greta's direct. He, likewise, misunderstands their agreement. So this case, sort of fully analyzed, we find that they agree, but each of them misunderstands this. Okay, now, hopefully that is a pretty clear case and not too complicated. So we'll go on to our next case. You can probably already see we got 3 lines. This is going to include third order intentionality, and it's going to be a lot more complex analysis. We can do full, all the way down to realization. So first thing we want to do is just look at the case and try to locate the perspectives. So I think it often helps, as I say, to sort of read it aloud. So here's what Jack says. Jack says, Jill is greedy. She knows that she is. She thinks that I think she is not. Jill, on the other hand, when we talk to her, Jill says, I am not greedy. He thinks that I am. He knows that I think I'm not. Okay. Now, we try to identify those perspectives, right? And you want to use underlining, you want to use double underlining, you want to use different colored markers, whatever you need to use in order to keep clear for you the difference between direct perspectives, meta perspectives, and meta-meta perspectives. Just use it and help yourself keep those clear and try to track them out. When I did the paper originally, I did use underlining, single underlining, underlining, double underlining, and triple underlining rather than, I didn't use this color system, but I think the color system is working pretty well here. Okay, so once we've identified them, now we can start analyzing their perspectives. When we look to their both persons' direct perspectives, we can ask, are they in agreement or disagreement? And in this case, we can see, obviously, they disagree. Jack says, Jill is greedy. Jill says, I am not greedy. When we move to the question of understanding or misunderstanding for Jack, again, we're comparing his meta perspective to her direct. So his meta is, she knows that she is. Jill says, I'm not greedy. We find a disjunction, and he misunderstands that they're in disagreement. Jill says, her meta perspective is, he thinks that I am, and Jack says, Jill is greedy. In this case, we find a conjunction between Jill's meta perspective and Jack's direct, so she understands that they disagree. Everybody see that? Okay, now we're going to go on to the feeling of being understood or the feeling of being misunderstood. Now, we compare Jack's direct perspective with his meta-meta perspective. Jill is greedy. She thinks that I think she is not. In this case, we find a disjunction, so Jack has the feeling of being misunderstood. Now, for Jill says, again, we're going to compare her direct to her meta-meta. Jill says, I am not greedy. He knows that I think I am not. Jill has the feeling of being understood. There's a conjunction between her direct and her meta-meta. Now we look to realization or failure to realization. We begin with Jack, and we look to his meta-meta, comparing it to Jill's meta perspective. We find a disjunction. That is, Jack fails to realize that he is understood. That is, that Jill understands. Now, Jill, when we go to look for her, and we're going to analyze her realization or not, failure to realize, we compare her meta-meta to Jack's meta, and we find, again, a disjunction. But here, because there was a different understanding and misunderstanding, Jill fails to realize that Jack misunderstands. That is, that she is misunderstood. Now, the case, all laid out simultaneously, sort of look at it, they disagree. Right? Again, you can do their agreement or disagreement as a single statement, whether they're in agreement or disagreement, but all the other ones you have to do individually. So they disagree. Jack misunderstands while Jill understands. Jack has the feeling of being misunderstood. Jack has the feeling of being misunderstood. Jill has the feeling of being understood. Jack fails to realize that Jill understands, and Jill fails to realize that Jack misunderstands. Okay. Hopefully that's okay with people. We'll go on to our next case. Hopefully this is also a lot easier to people. This is a very clear one, and you should be able to look at this right away, and I'll read the case out loud. Maybe you want to read it. Maybe this will be the last one I'm going to read out loud here. So this is Jean-Paul and Simone. So Simone says, Jean-Paul is ugly. He knows he is. He knows that I know he is. And Jean-Paul says, I am ugly. And Simone knows that I am. And she knows I know I am. Hopefully that is both pretty easy to understand and pretty clear enough for people to identify the direct meta and meta-meta perspectives. So when we go and we try to locate them, I think we identify them pretty quickly, and we begin our analysis. And I'm just going to now at this point use the arrow and the small letters to designate, and hopefully people are tracking enough to understand what's being said. We look at this case, and the first thing to do is to assess whether or not they're in agreement or disagreement. We compare their direct perspectives, and we see very clearly Simone says Jean-Paul is ugly. Jean-Paul says I am ugly. They're in agreement. When we look to understanding, we're looking at Simone's meta to Jean-Paul's direct. Simone says he knows he is. Jean-Paul says I am. They, in this case, she understands that they agree. Now notice, this maybe is the point to bring out, we could have talked about it with greedy, but maybe here, we're not talking about some ultimate metaphysical fact about whether or not Jean-Paul is ugly. We're talking about whether they agree or disagree on that fact, right? Whether or not from their vantage, that is the agreement or disagreement is the lowest level where we can get. We can't really get to the truth outside of what they're going to agree with or disagree with, at least for these kinds of analyses, right? So again, Simone understands. We go to Jean-Paul. He says Simone knows that I am, and Simone says Jean-Paul is ugly. So again, we find that he also understands. When we try to do the feeling of being understood or the feeling of being misunderstood, we compare direct to meta-meta. Simone says Jean-Paul is ugly. He knows that I think he is. She has the feeling of being understood. Jean-Paul too, he says I am ugly. She knows that I know I am. He has the feeling of being understood. Simone, when we're trying to assess her realization, her meta-meta says he knows that I know he is, and Jean-Paul's meta is Simone knows that I am. Again, she realizes that they're in agreement, or she realizes that Jean-Paul understands their agreement, right? So we move on to Jean-Paul. Jean-Paul, we look at his meta-meta and compare that to Simone's meta. He also realizes, because he says she knows that I know I am, and Simone says he knows he is. We analyze that case again. There it is, all fully splayed out. Simone and Jean-Paul agree. Each person understands that they agree. Both have the feeling of being understood, and both realize that they are understood, that the other person understands. Now, let's take this case. I only got two left here, so there's this one and one more. We have Romeo and Juliet. And so we look first at that case. And there it is. So you want to read through that here for a second. And while you're doing that, then you want to try to locate the perspectives. See if you can identify in there where are the direct perspectives, where are the meta perspectives, where are the meta perspectives. And once you've had those identified, we're ready to begin our analysis. So there they are identified, and we begin with the looking for agreement or disagreement by comparing direct perspectives. Romeo says, I love Juliet, and Juliet says, Romeo loves me. Notice we're staying on the same issue. It has the question of Romeo's love for Juliet. That's the question. And that's the issue that we're having the agreement about. Now, although they're in agreement, let's look at the rest of this case. We look to understanding, misunderstanding, beginning with Romeo. Romeo says she thinks I don't love her, and yet Juliet says Romeo loves me. So Romeo misunderstands. When we look to Juliet, Juliet says he doesn't know that he loves me, but Romeo says I love Juliet. So she also misunderstands. Now when we go to the feeling of being understood or feeling of being misunderstood, we look to Romeo and his direct and his meta-meta. And he says, I love Juliet. She thinks that I think that I don't love her. So he has the feeling of being misunderstood. Juliet, she, again, comparing her direct perspective to her own meta-meta perspective, she says, Romeo loves me. He thinks that I think he doesn't love me. she also has the feeling of being misunderstood. Now we ask the question of realization or failure to realize. Now we compare Romeo's meta-meta perspective to Juliet's direct. He says, she thinks that I don't love her, and then Juliet says, he doesn't know that he loves me. So Romeo kind of realizes in some way, right? There's a conjunction there. We looked at Juliet. Juliet says, he thinks that I think he doesn't love me. And then Romeo says, she thinks I don't love her. She also realizes that there is a misunderstanding. And so this case fully splayed out, there it is. We find that Romeo and Juliet agree. They agree. Each of them misunderstand their agreement. Moreover, each have the feeling of being misunderstood. And finally, each person realizes that the other person misunderstands. Okay, now we'll go on to our last case. I think this is probably one of the more difficult cases, and begin by looking at it and seeing if you can identify the direct perspectives, meta perspectives, and meta-meta perspectives. Okay, you're trying to locate those, and hopefully you've located them. It looks something like that. And here I've tried to mix it up a little bit to get you to realize that oftentimes they don't appear as simply as they are in the text. And this is very true when you're doing the analysis. So if some person would want to go and watch some trashy talk show on TV and watch people haggle and squabble, you're going to have to capture live time discourse and then maybe arrange it and look for direct perspectives, meta-meta perspectives, direct perspectives, meta perspectives, and meta-meta perspectives. In everyday life, it always, it's not as clean and tidy as these cases are perhaps making it seem. But anyway, so there they are identified. We're now ready to begin our analysis. So first thing to do is to look and to compare the direct perspectives for agreement or disagreement. And we look, and Olivia here, she says, I really do respect him. She says, I really do. And yet Wilbur says she doesn't respect me. So in this case, what we find is a disagreement, right? They're in disagreement over whether or not Olivia respects Wilbur. Okay, now we try to see, does Olivia understand or misunderstand this? Well, Olivia's meta perspective is Wilbur thinks I don't respect him, whereas Wilbur's direct is she doesn't respect me. So Olivia understands that, right? She understands that they're in a disagreement. Now, when we go to Wilbur, we compare his meta perspective to her direct. So Wilbur's meta perspective is she well knows that she doesn't respect me, whereas Olivia says, I really do. So Wilbur misunderstands. Again, now we can raise this question of what is the source of this misunderstanding? Why is there confusion? Why is there the inability to have an agreement there? Well, there could be all kinds of reasons, but at any case, we can see a discrepancy between, Wilbur's understanding or misunderstanding of it from Olivia's, right? So we look now to the question of feeling of being understood or feeling of being misunderstood. In this case, Olivia, we look for the connection between her direct and her meta-meta. In this case, she says, I really do, but he thinks that I think that I really don't respect him. So she has the feeling of being misunderstood. When we try to do this same assessment for Wilbur, Wilbur says, she doesn't respect me. That's his direct perspective. His meta-meta perspective is, she knows that I know that she doesn't respect me. So he has the feeling of being understood. Right? He does have the feeling of being understood. When we ask the question of realization, now we're going to do each of them. We start with Olivia's, and we look to Olivia's meta-meta perspective, comparing it to Wilbur's meta. And Olivia says, he thinks that I think I don't really respect him, whereas Wilbur says, Olivia well knows that she doesn't respect me. So Olivia realizes, right? Now when we go to Wilbur, Wilbur says, and we're going to compare, for realization and failure to realize, we compare Wilbur's meta-meta to Olivia's meta, and Wilbur says, she knows that I know she doesn't respect me, and then Olivia says, Wilbur thinks I don't respect him. Okay, so we can see in this case, if you splay the entire thing out, and just look at the arrangements right there of all the different terms, you find that Olivia and Wilbur disagree. Wilbur misunderstands, whereas Olivia understands that they disagree. Olivia has the feeling of being misunderstood, whereas Wilbur has the feeling of being understood. Wilbur realizes that he is understood, that is, that Olivia understands that they disagree. Olivia realizes that she is misunderstood, that Wilbur misunderstands that they disagree. Okay, one of the final set of exercises here, I have two more sets of exercises that I'm not going to walk through, but I would encourage people to take the time, look carefully at those two cases, and see if you can identify first order intentionality, second order intentionality, and third order. That is, you're trying to track direct perspectives, meta perspectives, and meta-meta perspectives, and then see if you can, with underlining, with different colored pens, with the little notation marks, you know, the A, D, M, U, those different marks, you're able to track exactly what those cases are. And feel free to post those down in the comments below. Also, another thing that you can do is to compose an original case or two for other people to examine, offer those up. One of the difficulties there, just to remind people, is to make sure that you keep it on the exact same issue, because if it isn't on the same issue, it becomes very confusing. I will also say, if anyone is interested, this may be posted sometime fairly soon on my academia.edu site. Okay, hope everyone is well, and take care. Bye-bye.